A taper jig really is just a couple of straight pieces of wood or metal with a hinge on one end and some kind of device at the other end for holding the angle that you need for the taper you want to cut. And besides the handle for pushing it through, the only other piece on the taper jig is the stop that holds the workpiece from slipping down the jig. There's really not much to using the taper jig other than that you have to pay attention to what you're doing as always, and there's just a couple little things we can show you to make this more accurate. First, I mark the length of the taper, and that shows me where on the piece I want the taper to start. Then I go to the other end and mark how far into the piece I want the taper to go. And then I can use a straight edge of some kind to connect these two marks. This line just really shows us what the taper is going to look like and then lets us confirm later on that we're actually cutting on the line we wanted to. And we only have to do this layout once if we're cutting tapers on a bunch of pieces that are the same size, or cutting the same taper on both sides of this leg. Next, I use a square to extend those layout marks down the thickness of the wood so that it would meet the table when the piece is laying down. And we extend the other layout point the same way. Now we put the wood in the taper jig and adjust the angle of the taper jig and the position of the fence so that we get the layout lines so that they meet the edge of the miter slot. And I always use the left miter slot for this. And here you can see that the other layout line is also on the same edge of the miter slot. With both of those points on the edge of the miter slot, I can go ahead and lock the jig at that angle. Next, I move the fence and jig over so I can set the blade height. As I always do, I set the blade so it's just over the surface of the wood. We don't want a lot of blade showing. Next, we want to set the blade to fence distance so that when we slide the wood into the blade, it contacts the wood right at our layout mark. Once that's set, lock the fence down and then recheck this to make sure the fence didn't move a little bit. Now I stand behind the fence with my fingers over the top of my fence so I can just hold the wood down and pull it slightly toward the fence. This way my fingers are always pulling away from the blade. Then I just use the handle to push it through because all the forces of the saw are actually pushing the wood against the jig. Sometimes you want to cut the same taper on both sides of a leg. People used to just tape the cutoff piece back on and then cut the other side. But that got you close, but it wasn't perfect. To do it right, we need to replace the amount of wood that the blade takes out. Here I'm going to set the saw so it just cleans up this edge of the wood. I'll make one full rib cut that way. I'm just taking off enough to clean up this side of the board and then index it to the width of the fence to the blade. I'm using a full curve 1/8 inch wide blade, so I'm going to move the fence 1/4 of an inch closer to the blade. Now I make a second rip cut, and the cutoff piece is exactly 1/8 of an inch thick. And that will make a perfect shim. And now rather than just taping the cutoff piece back on, we want to put the shim in between that and the workpiece. And that shims that piece out so it's back to exactly square again. Now with the cutoff piece and a shim taped to the taper that we just cut, I can put that side against the jig without moving anything else and make a second cut and taper the other side. This way when I cut the second side, we get exactly the same taper as we have on the other side of the leg. And that's just because the shim replaces the wood that the saw cut out when we cut the other side. And here you can see that using the shim, both of the cutoff pieces are exactly the same size. And that means the tapers on both sides are the same size as well.